one of the Russian tactics, let me put it this way. They barge into your, imagine, studio, no license plates on the cars. I don't know, 6 foot, whatever, tall men, all in masks. You can only see the eyes.
Don't know what department they're with. Don't know what agency they're with.
There is nothing on them. It's a black uniform with everything. You can't even see the hair. Nothing. There's nothing that could suggest you their identity or who they are. Barge into your office. They scare people that work for you. They confiscate and break every. They not just grab your stuff from your office. They also intimidate you and threaten you. And leave. And you never to see your computers back, you never to see your equipment back, it's never returned. And the next thing you know that you are under a criminal investigation for X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's something as silly as, a lot of journalists went through that actually, when they would just throw, drugs under your couch, like random things, and everybody knows like, he never used drugs, it's ridiculous, but you cannot do anything about it.
I'm Paul Johnson. I'm with the Optimistic American, and we're here to talk about hope. Now, my guest today, Regina Revarova, is a Russian immigrant who was actually a reporter with the BBC. She grew up in Russia. She became a reporter. She can talk about her perspective of life there, but she had to end up going into exile because free speech there just isn't honored the way that it is in the United States. We're going to talk about the First Amendment and the freedom of speech, but we really want to tie that into some of the threats that are happening here inside the United States with cancel culture. Cancel culture and what's taking place on many of our college campuses today that are shutting out speakers because of alternative ideas just simply fails to recognize how important it is that we have to flush out our ideas in the open marketplace. Today in the United States, one of the reasons why we've been able to do so much better than 2/3 of the world with Russia and China is because those countries are authoritarian governments where only one opinion matters. And when that one opinion is all that matters, there's no challenging that happens to the idea. So you don't really know if it's the truth or if it's the best possible solution. What cancel culture does, by canceling out other ideas, canceling out people who don't think it, who aren't willing to think the same, has multiple deleterious effects. One is we lose the ability to have the better idea. But 2, we begin to lose the strength and resilience that comes from people being able to talk to one another, specifically people who don't always agree on the same thing. Regina is going to be a great help in us understanding what it looks like in other countries, but also in us beginning to think about what's happening here and how we might be able to make some change. Welcome, Regina. How are you doing today?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
All right, so what we want to talk about today is we're going to talk a little bit about, obviously, free speech. We're going to talk about things like cancel culture and what's happening in the current political situation. And then we want to talk about how maybe technology can change that. You come from a very, very unique position on all three, and I'm deeply interested in it. You were a reporter for, I believe, the BBC in Russia. You were born in Russia?
The BBC was one of the agencies, yes. Majority of my agencies that I worked with were Moscow-based agencies. And when we still had a gulp of freedom, those were the years.
And so free speech had a very interesting meaning to you. You came to the United States. You became an associate professor at ASU, but you also have a business that's focused on helping people communicate, helping people get their message out to the world. I want to talk about all of them, but if you don't mind, can we start just on the whole idea of where you came from and your journey in Russia?
Sure thing. Okay, I'll start where I'm from. I was born and raised in a small mining town, which is in North Siberia. So if you look at the map, it's above Mongolia. There's nothing really, there's not much really there. It was a city of 20,000 people at that time.
How did your family end up in Siberia?
I'll tell you, because we're not from Siberia, obviously. My family is from Caucasus. Caucasus is right, if you look at the map, it's nearby Ukraine, not far away from Ukraine,
Right.
a little bit
Mountain
south.
range with the oil in it.
Exactly, where Americans have a word Caucasian. That like honestly, I'm Caucasian because Caucasians are people from Caucasus, so it was always so confusing for me to see that word on the applications. My mom is ethnic Georgian. My father is ethnic Ossetian. Both it's Caucasus regions. One is the south, which is independent now for the past 32 years. The north side is still Russia. Is still part of Russia. There are many different ethnicities there living, and it has seen its shares of wars and destabilization for sure for centuries now. How we ended up in Siberia before we were born, my brother and I, it was 80s. My mom and dad, they got married in 80s. Total economic disaster. The Soviet Union is about to collapse, but nobody knows. Because again, there's no press, there's nothing. You cannot learn about things, but what people are seeing is empty shelves, a salary that is withheld for 6 to 8 months. Then they would give them these vouchers where you could purchase X amount of butter and milk. And so things are really, really tight. My parents are engineers, and the only thing that they could find an opportunity was in this tiny, small mining town within the former Soviet Union that actually produced 70% of Russian diamonds are coming from the town where I was born. 17 years there. I graduated high school there. We would go back and forth between Caucasus, sometimes visiting my grandma, although it was thousands of miles away. And when I was at the age of 17, I moved actually to Caucasus to study journalism because there was nothing. There was nothing.
Okay, what year would it have been when you went to the Caucasus to study journalism?
2001.
Okay, so at that point in time, let me just get a little bit of historical perspective. The Constitution was written in like 1993. There was a First Amendment clause that was put into the Constitution, not nearly as in-depth as ours, but it still said that there was a right to free speech.
That is correct.
And so with the emerging Russia that was coming from the Gorbachev era, there were freedoms that were being implemented. So going to school in journalism might have made sense.
I went to school in journalism not because I wanted to pursue. At that time, when you're 17, you're not thinking about these global big ideas as freedom of speech. At least we were never taught that. I remember that I went to school right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of the things that we were learning were based on old textbooks of a country that didn't exist anymore. Although I'm thankful that I didn't go, my brain was not washed the way it is washed now by in public schools in Russia for sure. It was time of no identity. I call it no identity. It was time of lots of crime, the insumerable level of corruption. Down to, I don't know, courts. There was nothing that a person as a person could do to accept. My dad went into business immediately after the collapse of Soviet Union because everybody lost their jobs. And in order to provide for his family, he just, he opened a small store. He named it Regina. And he basically started to, just a small business owner. But I remember he had to bribe every policeman there.
Wow.
Every, you literally, it's a mafia type of governance on a local level and on a national level too, because this is what Putin is. It's just the levels of different things. Levels of the same thing. So to answer your question, also don't forget that it was early 2000s when I moved to Caucasus. The war is raging in Chechnya at that time.
Okay.
Still raging. It's a second campaign. Chechnya, I want to remind you that it's an ethnicity that never wanted to live under Russians ever. Since Russia occupied Caucasus, they had nothing in common with Russians. They wanted a separate republic, and they were trying to get away in early 90s. It didn't work out. So that's the second campaign. Russia has done Russian tanks and Russian army has done exact same. You can trace the same exact tactics as they're utilizing now in Ukraine. Level everything. everything, level everything. There are no casualties. There are no civilians. Just level everything. So, and that was the year when I moved to Caucasus.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you become, you get your degree in reporting, and you go to work in the reporting field.
Before. You know what happened, Paul, actually, that brought me really into journalism. I went into journalism thinking I just want to tell stories. I didn't think about, I thought, I honestly wanted to be one day Chekhov or Dostoevsky, to write books, and it wasn't anything like I want to report on news and on war. Or
Gosh, the Russians are definitely, they have some amazing authors and writers.
Yeah, because Russia never developed philosophy as a separate branch of discipline. Russians don't have philosophy. So what happened is literature and philosophy is the same thing in Russia. That's why Dostoevsky can be very deep, and Chekhov can be very deep and philosophical. That's because of that. And so that was really, I just kind of followed my gut instincts. I didn't want to work for mine. I had no interest in that, but I loved telling stories. I was writing in our small school newspaper for my last 2-3 years of school. But what really brought me into journalism was in 2004 in North Ossetia, which is very close to Chechnya. Imagine, the war is raging in Chechnya, but information comes through, but it's Russia, remember. It's all filtered. I'm living in North Ossetia. I'm studying journalism. I started reporting way before I graduated. And then September 1st, 2004, where every public school in Russia starts on September 1st every year. There was a small city in North Ossetia where I lived, Beslan. It was about an hour drive from the capital where I used to study. Chechen rebels basically took a hostage the entire school. Thousands of people were taken as hostages. Majority of them are kids. Because it was the September 1st, everybody was there. It's like a little parade there, and everybody's with balloons and flowers and greeting, and parents are there. They take them as hostages. They I don't know how much I can go into this, but for the 3 days, they held thousands of people there. More than 1,000 people there. And on the third day, Russia just bombed it from tanks. Bombed the school, not bombed, but what do you call it when they shoot from the tanks? I don't know.
Artillery.
That's Russia. That's what Russia does. If there is something like that, they would rather sacrifice all the civilians, because what the Chechen rebels wanted is independence, and it was a constant. They had these type of events in Moscow. There are a number of events that were very sad all across Russia that derived from that war for independence. So Russia just levels the school, and I'm not going to go into glory descriptions of what happened, but more than 300 people burned alive in the school. Most of them children. 186 were kids. 0 to high school, basically. And that's when I think that was the moment when the fog cleared for me. I was 19 at that time, and I realized that I live in a horrible society. I live in an absolutely terrible, terrible place. And I did not know whether the entire world is like this, because we're pretty isolated in Russia from everything else that's happening. I did not know, because I heard that before the Beslan hostage, the school that was taken as hostage, there was the explosion in London's subway. I'm like, maybe the entire world is this horrible, but there's something wrong where your own government that is supposed to protect you decides to level the school with all the people in it, instead of speaking to the people that caused it, rather than looking into the causes of it. I don't know, rather than doing something more civilized.
All right, so the So the fog of this list for you, and obviously that gives you some type of revelation. What's that revelation?
The first time in my life, I think, there are things in people's life that it's before and after. Before the earthquake and after, before the divorce and after, before you pick and choose, right? That was for me definitely that moment when, I don't know, I lost the innocence for sure, right there and then.
And you start to begin to build, who am I?
Who is the society I live in? What is the society I live in?
And you were a reporter at that time? Are you reporting?
I was a reporter, yeah. I was reporting it was a media agency tied to agency that was shut down 2 weeks before the war. I think it was 2 weeks before the war in Ukraine. Memorial, that was very, very large human rights organization, Paul. And they they reported on things that you cannot possibly ever touch in Russia. Gulags and Siberian camps. And
so when you were in school, did the Gulag Archipelago, was it actually a book that people read at the time?
No.
All pretty much
And today
banned?
it's questioned. Today it's questioned. There are people that really would argue with you that it ever happened.
Right. Yeah, I mean, theoretically, well, I don't know if it's theoretical. The theory is that from 1917 to the 1950s, at least according to Solzhenitsyn, about 1/6 of Russian population went to
Perished.
a gulag, and about 25% of them perished, which is close to 60 million people.
Yeah.
And so when it's questioned, do you think, in your view, do you believe that to be factual, or would you?
No. There are no facts behind it. When you lie, Paul, it's just on a human level. When we all know that when liars lie, there is no bottom to the lies.
Right.
Like, I can just lie forever. I can lie as much as I want. I can tell you whatever I want.
So your estimate is that maybe more?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Absolutely. Yeah. We don't even know. Solzhenitsyn was the only person who, thanks God, brought into our attention something that was happening there. Is it all? I doubt it. I doubt it. Yeah.
And I know that he wrote the book, and he said that he had to keep most of it in his head because he couldn't actually write it out. But when he actually came out and translated it, it was 2,100 pages. I mean, it's an amazing read.
Yeah.
And of course, it changed the world because it took a lot of other places who all of a sudden recognized they didn't want to be a part of Russia anymore because they recognized what the problems were. But I think that it played a large role in the coming down of the Soviet Union. And to me, that's kind of the magic to free speech. That's kind of the beginning point, is to recognize that that without the ability to question one's government, you can't tell whether or not something's being done wrong or not. As you said, there's no way of knowing what that real number was.
And the fact that people are denying today, some people are denying in Russia, it's coming from Kremlin. Also, it's coming from Kremlin because Kremlin spent more than 30 years now idealizing Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see that, when you watch Putin, he definitely has begun to put Stalin and the Soviet Union back up at the top as if that's the ideal place as to where they want to be. All right, so you are there, maybe we'll call it the fog of war is lifted for you. You begin to recognize that there are challenges within your own government. Again, very much a Solzhenitsyn idea, right? Which was, he first identified what he had been doing wrong, the fact that he had been buying into an ideology that allowed him to do things that he shouldn't have done. But by doing that, he was then able to recognize that the ideology was actually playing a role in clouding his good judgment. And that is a fog of war being removed.
But when you're born with that ideology, it becomes part of you. You don't question. I don't question.
That's true.
That I
because
have
he became
black
a
hair,
communist.
right?
Yeah.
Like you don't question these things. If you want to change the color of your hair, you can. You can dye your hair, but you're not going to sit down and question the color of your hair. The same thing, I think, is this. But then something happens in your life that all of a sudden wakes you up. And you want to go back because that was so comfy right there, right then. It was just, life was much better there, but you cannot.
So when do you start making a decision that you have to leave Russia?
I married right after college, pretty early, to another journalist, actually. We were in the same space. My ex-husband, he is now teaching. He's actually teaching political science at the University of Kansas, or Kansas University. I keep forgetting this.
Although it's interesting that both of you became professors of sorts.
He's more professor than I am for sure, because he wanted to do it. He wanted to go to academia to write research and write articles about things that he knows very well about. So we married. I married right after college. We kept reporting. He was working while my major news outlets that I reported were based in Russia. He was very proficient in English. He spent 13 years living in Europe, in Italy, in England, and he started working right off the bat when he could. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, years later, actually, he was a school teacher. He started working for the Institute for the War and Peace Reporting. It's a very well-known organization outside of the United States.
So he started working for...
IWPR has basically agencies. They cover all the hot spots of when there is a war in Yugoslavia. They had journalists there training them, reporting on things that are happening independently. Iraq, the same thing. Afghanistan, the same thing. So what they're really good at, because they have this experience of people running into complete, conflict with the local governments. Because again, you're working in the hot spots, and it's not safe. As soon as my ex-husband would get tons of threats, but till the last moment we were like, it's just part of the deal. This is how it functions. This is what the profession takes. And but then one day, they one of the Russian tactics, let me put it this way, they barge into your imagined studio, no license plates on the cars. I don't know, 6 foot whatever tall men, all in masks. You can only see the eyes.
Don't know what department they're with. Don't know what agency they're with.
There is nothing on them. It's a black uniform with everything. You can't even see the hair. Nothing. There's nothing that could suggest you their identity or who they are. Barge into your office. They scare people that work for you. They confiscate and break every. They not just grab your stuff from your office, they also intimidate you and threaten you and leave. And you never to see your computers back, you never to see your equipment back, you never, it's never returned. And the next thing you know that you're under a criminal investigation for X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's something as silly as, a lot of journalists went through that actually, when they would just throw, drugs under your couch, like random things, and everybody knows he never used drugs. It's ridiculous, but you cannot do anything about it. In his case, it was IWPR could not get registered in Caucasus because the Russian government would deny. And my ex-husband was investigated for, I think it was I forgot how they phrased it, but you're working for an organization that is not registered there. I don't remember the details really, because I tried to forget them for so long. And we were granted political asylum. We came here I came here, I joined him basically. We had, it was the worst part. It was the worst time of my life, this transition for sure. Because
were you terrified when you left?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people think that immigration is something positive. A lot of people think, well, of course, they're now in America and they're going to be fed and clothed and, things are so well there. It's probably the hardest thing that happened to me in my entire life. I had no English in 2008. I will tell you a story that I really love. It kind of stuck in my brain. I landed in Dulles International Airport, and there were 2 lines as you come from international flight. There are 2 lines. One said citizens, another said non-citizens. And I'm looking at it. He was meeting me. He left earlier. He left in haste. I joined him later. I'm looking at 2 lines, and I can read, but I cannot comprehend what these words mean. And I'm looking at it, and and people are lining, and I cannot ask anyone, because how would I ask? I don't have the language. It was Air France, so there were French people and American people, so there were no, I didn't hear any Russian speech on the plane. And I'm looking at these words, and I'm like, citizen. I'm looking at the word citizen. Citizens, first 2, 3, 4 letters were cities. Like, it's like city. It's like New York City. Maybe I'm like, maybe this country is divided this way. Half of them are going to cities and half of them are going to villages. So non-citizen is for those that are going to villages. I remember Valeria told me that we're going to live in city. It was a Silver Spring in Maryland. And I'm like, I think I will have to take the line that says citizen, because I'm going to city. Duh. And when people then, when you realize that you made a mistake, when you're showing your papers to go through the customs, or I don't remember what it was, then you're more terrified. Little tiny mistake, you're absolutely now incapable of making a simplest step in your life.
Because that simple mistake has to lead you to a fear that maybe now that keeps you from getting to where you're trying to go.
Absolutely, absolutely. But the notion of,
and you're used to bureaucrats. Bureaucrats oftentimes are bad no matter where they are, but you're worse to bureaucrats. They're a lot worse.
Absolutely. But Paul, it's the notion of, you used to eat holding your spoon in one hand. Now you cannot hold that spoon anymore. You don't know how the society functions at all. It's not just about language. How about the cultural norms? What do you do here and there? Like, every little step becomes a struggle, because it's so different from anything you really knew.
All right, so how long did it take you to start to acclimate, to feel like you were a part of this place? Are you there yet?
I am, of course I am. Let me see. It's hard to put the number on it. I think a lot of immigrants, we're in survival modes for years and years and years, even when things get better, and your brain still cannot comprehend that you're safe. You're not any more steps away from homeless shelter. You're self-sufficient. You're part of the society. You understand, but on the emotional level, sometimes to these days, I feel that some sort of anxiety kicks in, and you feel a little bit. What if you start overthinking things quickly, and you go back into those? I think it was about 10 years where it was just one after another. It was never-ending cycle of events. Yeah.
Back to the just the whole issue of being a reporter in Russia. I think about in 1993 was when the Constitution passed, and they actually passed the first rights to be able to have guaranteed speech. And Americans tend to think that we have this longer version of it, that we've had it since the beginning of our Constitution. But really, the freedom of speech has evolved here. In fact, the case that gave us the rights that we have today happened in 1969, so it wasn't that long ago. We used to have in Britain, when we were British citizens, they had what they called censors. And these censors, you would have to bring all of your documents to, anything that you were writing or you were publishing, and they'd read it. And they could pull out a sentence, they could pull out a paragraph, or they could say, no, you can't publish any of it, right? So these censors became the way that you were able to get comments into the public domain. Even when the Constitution passed in the United States, we didn't include the freedom of speech in the Constitution. We waited 10 years until the Bill of Rights passed, and then we included the First Amendment, which guaranteed the right both of religion, speech, and assembly. 6 years after that, Adams passed the Sedition Act. When he passed the Sedition Act, he basically said, hey, you can't say anything bad about the government, including the president, Congress, or any laws that they passed. Now, he left out on purpose the vice president. That's because the vice president then was from the other party. His name was Thomas Jefferson. And they said it's going to expire as soon as my term's over. Right? So it's very clear they were just trying to keep you from criticizing one government. But all the way up until Oliver Wendell Holmes in the United States, we were criticizing. If people criticized the government, they could go to jail. There was one guy who, during World War I, wrote a book that criticized the British for the Revolutionary War shooting American soldiers, and they put him in jail for it because we were trying to become an ally with the British in World War I. Well, Oliver Wendell Holmes was fascinating because for a long period of time, in about 1919, he had opposition to any type of free speech. What he said was, look, it's an act. And if the government decides that an act is bad, they're the ones who are the determiners of the truth. And if they determine that what you're saying is wrong, then you can go to jail for it. It can be considered sedition. Well, he was reading, there were a group of people who were trying to have an influence on him. He read a book by Adam Smith that was about the wealth of nations, competition in the free marketplace. And he also read John Stuart Mill, who John knew that Oliver would not buy into the idea that this was about individuals. He didn't really care about the individual liberty portion of it. What he cared about was society and how to make certain that it was protected. What John Stuart Mill did in his book is he purported the idea that said, this is important for a society because how do you know what the truth is?
Right.
You should protect the act, but then you need to invite people from all over the world to criticize that act so you can think through what really is the truth. And then what in the dissenting opinion, it wasn't the majority opinion, he wrote the dissenting opinion in a case called Abrams, where he said, look, we need a free marketplace of ideas. And for a free marketplace of ideas to exist, you have to have free speech. Now, that later on evolved, and they used Oliver Wendell Holmes' comments to begin to build out these liberties that we know from the First Amendment. But I try to tell people all the time, not only is it not guaranteed around the world, it's not necessarily guaranteed here. We haven't had it that long.
Yeah.
And to me, what you were trying to do as a reporter probably would have saved Putin from the embarrassment that he's in today.
Yeah.
Right? The embarrassment that he's in today, he's in a huge problem. He is never going to be able to participate in any world event again. No world leader is going to acknowledge him. We're going to have sanctions on Russia for maybe decades. They're in trouble. But had reporters been allowed to report on what was going on in Chechnya, and had those criticisms been real, even if he wouldn't have been replaced, he would have had to modify that behavior. None of us, no one acting by ourselves, knows what's in the best interest of everyone else.
You are thinking too well of Russia. That's the major mistake.
Okay, I want to hear it.
Americans make this mistake over and over again. You're thinking too well. Not just reporters. Generals cannot tell the truth. Business elites cannot tell the truth. All they do to, I shouldn't curse in this podcast, but all they do to save their positions is basically, and they caught up on this early, 22 years ago. Putin was in power for more than 22 years ago, 22 years. They caught up on a notion that in order to save their yachts, their luxurious lives, themselves, they just need to make sure that they're providing the president with the information that the president wants to hear. Not just journalists. Forget about journalists. Everybody is there serving the Tsar. About the Constitution, I want to tell you the major difference between our societies, right?
Russian and the American?
Yeah, Russian and the American, because, I spent 24 years of my life there. It's still a big part of me, although nowadays it's more difficult for me to communicate with Russians, for sure, for sure. The major difference, Paul, what is Constitution? What is Constitution? What is American Constitution? It's not just that thin book that I have in my house. I have 2 copies of Constitution. It is much more. It's customs, it's history, it's beliefs, it's morals, it's culture. I can go on and on. And then there's a constitution, but there's also piles and piles and piles and piles of, if you visualize it in the books that make that constitution work, and human beings, it's an enormous amount of, humans and stuff and written words and that are internalized by the society. That never happened in Russia. There's nothing like that. There's a thin piece of paper that says something that no one cares about. Absolutely no one cares about. Never was it internalized by Russians.
Interesting. Yeah, so what you're pointing out to me is while I talk about their Constitution of 1993, what does it matter? If at the end of the day, the people don't pay attention to it, it doesn't become a part of their mores, their standards, their norms.
They never fought for it. It was just given to them, you know.
It doesn't matter.
No one ever read it, you know. They kind of know that it exists. Sometimes journalists appeal to it, but we quickly, you know, some journalists, majority of journalists are controlled by government, of course. So there's a tiny minority of people that are trying to refer to it, and it's laughable because...
You know, is Russia, in your mind, is it, you know, I spent time in St. Petersburg, and gosh, that was very Western. I mean, it was very Western. Then I spent time in Moscow. Moscow was really not very Western. It was quite the opposite. Would you see it? I mean, I don't think Putin sees himself as it being a Western nation. Do most of the people there see themselves as being influenced or a part of the West?
On a human level, when I lived there, Paul, the collective West, which is the United States, for Russians, the United States is part of the collective West, was such a foreign concept to me personally and to everybody around me. We knew we're not quite Asians, but I don't think we ever internalized there was ever a notion that we belong to Europe. And remember, St. Petersburg was part of what? Finland or Switzerland? When was
Finland.
one of those countries, right? So Russia annexed southernmost developed part of Finland in 1937. They've done exact same thing as they're doing right now in Ukraine. They leveled everything. It was a bloody war. They're annexing the most developed part of Finland. They're turning it into another Soviet territory, which became very sad very fast. Things that you see there in St. Petersburg, yes, they were based on European norms, and because it was for a long time it was part of Europe. So Finland's economic development all of a sudden moved from that southern part. Now the north of Finland is the most viable, and it's a democratic country, and it's so. When it comes to these wars where Russia grabbed territories here and there, it always reminds me who really won in this war.
Do you see there's ever being any chance for Russia to be westernized and to gain Western democratic values? You
know how?
How?
When it stops to exist as an empire, when it's broken into territories that it originally was part of, that's when we will get very friendly countries that will all have different phases and parts and forms of development, their own culture. That's when people will finally be able to protest against government, because if I'm protesting somewhere in Far East against you in Moscow, good luck to me. You know, I will be silenced before I say anything. Right? That's when the change is going to happen. Absolutely. Before that, as an empire, I absolutely don't see. I see it as a threat to the world as an empire.
How have your views of the United States changed since before you left? How did you see the United States when you were in Russia, and how do you see it today?
As part of the United States, and when before the United States. Remember, I was in journalism. Remember, when you're in journalism at that time in early 2000s, I was exposed to a lot of foreigners, mostly Europeans, but there were some Americans that would come and report for large, like I'm mispronouncing it now, but there was a magazine, international magazine or Vanity Fair, you know, people that would write these extensive articles about features, and sometimes it's biographies, and I used to work with foreigners a lot, and it was a completely different level of journalism, always. It was completely different. You can sense it, you can feel it, and that's why when I came here, I decided to restudy the journalism, because I was really curious about where these norms came from. The norms in my profession were born and bred here in the United States, and then they spread and took different forms in different parts of the world. So how I saw Americans, it was a very different view, of course. Plus, there was part of propaganda that constantly tells you that everybody is against you, and you as Russians, you need to be on guard, and there's that absolutely. there were lots of cultural surprises for me when I got here. How just Americans are much more relaxed and friendly than I could ever imagine, for sure. That is, you cannot find anything like that. Maybe in St. Petersburg. That's another thing, Paul, that I want to tell you is that you travel 20 miles away from St. Petersburg. You travel 20 miles away from Moscow. It's a completely different country. It's poor.
Yeah.
They don't have basic things that we currently have in our condos, in our houses, in our, it's a very different set.
Mm-hmm. All right. So your view of the U.S. After you get here, do you notice a difference in the liberties and the freedoms?
Absolutely. But I also was very surprised. When I got here without a language, I made a decision. I could not see myself outside of the field that I'm in. Mm-hmm. What was surprising is I studied the language. I did my master's, and NPR offered me an opportunity to join them in Washington, D.C. and report for them. I started again from the scratch, from intern and then production assistant, and and it was a big honor because it's NPR, and I listen to their programs a lot, especially now they have so many podcasts that they air. I felt it was an amazing opportunity, yet after spending about 8 months within the headquarters, I couldn't see myself there. Mm-hmm. I was very appreciative of things that I learned. I was appreciative of the level of the discussion that Americans have, that Russia never, ever had, ever. And I constantly kept thinking and, of course, comparing. And I'm like, oh, this is where the stagnation happens.
I think I read too many Russian authors because I always see them having these discussions at these high levels.
Yeah, at the high levels, exactly. All by yourself, but not as a society. Society does not talk about these vital, important things and then makes these discussions available to the public. And they can be, one of the things that I remember we were talking about on the phone, if I'm not mistaken, you were mentioning the polarization of American society. Yes. And how these, and what shall we do? As I thought about it for the longest time, and Paul, my opinion is that maybe we should stop resisting to it. Maybe this is where we're headed, because watching how you and I are sitting in the same room, we might be consuming absolutely different type of information. We're reading different types of books. I will be very surprised if we're listening to the same podcast, for example, right? Our news sources might be very different, and we're gonna get into those clusters more and more.
There's value. I worked with Republicans and Democrats both, and I can promise you, we need them both. We need, Republicans. Democrats do a pretty good job of focusing on programs for individuals, education, and Social Security, and those types of things. Republicans do a good job of focusing on things that revolve around the human spirit, like entrepreneurship. I can't imagine this country without Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who kind of hated each other. They were the left and the right at the time. But what bothers me, I become extremely worried. I know that there's a far right-wing group that wants to shut down communication, the white nationalists. I'm really worried about it when I see college students doing this on the left, because they're the exact group that should be defending those liberties, not trying to harm them. When I was mayor, the biggest cancel that I ever saw was we had passed a Martin Luther King Day in Arizona. I was a big fan of Martin Luther King. To me, he and Thomas Jefferson are very similar individuals.
That's in the 90s. Was it in the 90s?
1990s, yeah. And they both promoted, they both had flawed lives, but they both were promoting this concept that all men and women are created equal and that we're endowed upon by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. So in any event, we had a guy who became governor, a guy named Evan Meekum in Arizona, and he ended up taking out the Martin Luther King Day. And the very first thing that the NFL did is they canceled the Super Bowl. Now, I wanted to get the Martin Luther King Day passed. I knew we were going to have to do it by a vote. But I also knew that canceling of that event did more damage to our ability to get the Super Bowl implemented, because the public reacts negatively to it. Right? Instead of having a discussion, instead of allowing there to be a robust discussion about racism and how we deal with it, we are instead going to have to deal with, do we want to keep the Super Bowl or lose the Super Bowl? So I ended up going after a guy named Brayman who owned the Philadelphia Eagles. He was the guy that was talking about how immoral Arizona was for doing this. So I just called his car dealership, and I found out that he had his car dealership open on Martin Luther King Day. So I wrote a letter saying, look, if you want to be the moral watchdog of the NFL, why don't you close down your place? Of course, in Philadelphia, the minority community went nuts and said, yeah, why aren't you closing down your place?
Yeah.
So he was extremely angry with me. But what it did is it gave me the ability to refocus. This was the focus to me. I went out to a site. There was a little boy. I'll never forget this. A little African-American boy came up. I was in the mayor's car. And we had a light that they put on top, and he wanted to turn the light on, and he wanted to ride in the car, and he wanted to do all these other things. So I was having fun with these group of kids. And this little boy was just so cute. Anyway, and he got out of the car. He was probably 8 or 9 years old. And he said, Mayor, he said, I want to know something. Do you think people voted against Martin Luther King because he was black? Now, I gave him the reasons why it happened in our government. I gave him all the excuses, right? But no matter what, here's one little boy in our community who's wondering, are my opportunities going to be the same because of the color of my skin? That's what I wanted my public focused on.
Yeah.
I didn't want them focused on the Super Bowl because that was bound to divide us.
Yeah.
I believe in the goodness of Americans. I believe down deep they care about that little boy. They care about him feeling like he has the same chance to be able to participate. And I knew if we could get them focused on him and on that issue, we could be successful. Now, we're the only state in the nation, as it turns out, that ended up passing the Martin Luther King Day by the vote of the people. But the problem with cancel culture is that what it's doing is, to begin with, it's saying to the rest of the world that could be on their side, that may actually be sympathetic to their issues, that you don't even want a discussion. And Americans are going to reject that. It also, though, does damage to them because they're then in a position where they're not listening to alternative ideas. They're not in the marketplace of ideas. They need to put their ideas out. They need to listen to the other side. They need to become more resilient when they do that to understand the strength of it. I think that's where you were going when you said maybe it's important that we have both sides. And that's my view. There's not a damage by having both voices out there. There's only good that comes from it. And the answer to free speech when it's terrible is more free speech. It's more people speaking up and trying to present their side, not by trying to cancel them or stopping them from being able to communicate.
I completely agree with that. And Paul, I think that we're coming to these same. I can give you an example on ASU level. I don't know if you're familiar with the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. It was created actually by the governor's office, Doug Ducey's office, in conjunction with ASU, Michael Crow, as a response to this very same reality that all of a sudden we're awakening into, slowly, but we are, as a society, to wait a sec. Universities are not the places where you can express yourself freely anymore. And we haven't been like that for a long time. That school that was created in conjunction with the local government about 5 years ago was a response to that. Now, I'm not saying that it's going to be something phenomenal. I don't know where it's going to go. I'm just giving you an example that I think that's a very good sign that we're recognizing these things. And I want to tell you another thing is that Americans are very humble about the achievements. They've always been. And sometimes I'm like, it's not the place to be humble. You can't be humble about other things. But that's why I'm saying the polarity and the differences in opinions and views, and sometimes they can be very dangerous and sometimes they can be completely opposite and maybe make you angry. It's not just we have to live with it. We have to learn how to embrace it, really, really have to embrace it because there's no other way.
We're bombarded on a nightly basis by these news medias who take the extremes and magnify them, right? We, on our social media, people who know how to be uncivil to one another tend to become a louder voice, and I think it's partly because the algorithms promote them. But the answer to that is people being able to find more ways to talk about the other things. I believe there's so much good that's happening in this country. The idea that China is going to pass us by, not a chance. I mean, I can give you all types of statistics and data. They're not going to take over the world's reserve currency. They're not going to pass us up as the superpower. It's not going to take place. Look at what's happening in Ukraine, and you begin to understand the United States military power.
Yeah.
Economically, yeah, we're going to have inflation. That's going to may cause a recession. But as sure as we go down, we will come back up again.
Yeah.
I love the reporter's line in China who said, what I love about China is how great the economy is going. And they said, well, what do you love about the United States? He says, well, when it's going bad, people can say so. Right? There's an advantage to us being able to talk about what's going wrong.
Yeah.
But we also need to have a voice for what's going right and how things aren't as bad as you think.
Yeah.
And that's a field that you've started to step into. I know that you're creating a business to help people focus on podcasts. I want to know why you're doing that, how that related to your past life, and what you see as the value of that.
I couldn't see myself within the media landscape of the bigger media corporations.
Mm-hmm.
Could not. 2017, as soon as I secured my first client who I knew I'm going to survive for 1 year, it was not, it was like, I'm just going to try it for 1 year and see where I go, because I don't have business education, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
What I started doing is I started asking people like Bill Saul, how do you do this? How does it work? You register what and how do you, through the state, and how do you, okay, it's pretty simple. I still need some sort of help someone to help me with this. So basic question. What is supply chain? I know some of it's not about podcast, but I want to know. I started listening to a ton of podcasts about the entrepreneurs, and a lot of them are not coming from a standard business. Some of them are geologists and mathematicians. And
the great thing about entrepreneurs, you don't have to have a college diploma. You don't have to have a high school diploma. You can be anything that you imagine if you can come up with a product in America. If you can come up with a product that people want to buy.
In America, yes.
In America.
Yes, absolutely. And as an immigrant, Paul, it's very difficult for me to ever forget about the privileges that I acquired as a human being, as a woman, as soon as I became, the life granted me this amazing opportunity that I tremendously disliked for the first several years, because I was completely lost. I lost the only society that I knew. Now it was the biggest gift. If you take it, that's the problem. If you take it, because sometimes people reject gifts, and that's the worst thing that they can do to themselves. People reject gifts all the time. Mm-hmm. And so I started. We're not just working with clients producing podcasts, but we're also developing ideas that I think are important. There is a high level of a burnout among doctors. I don't know if you know terrible statistics. That was before COVID, for example. About 400 medical professionals a year commit suicide in the United States alone. That's how burned out people are. I think COVID probably changed those stats to, maybe increase the numbers, maybe not. I don't know.
Oh, I guarantee you, we have a couple hundred providers that work for our healthcare company directly, and COVID was a very hard period of time for providers.
Yeah. Why are they so burned out? Why, what is happening there? They spent 10, 12 years to study for the medicine, doctors. Something is happening there. Well, I'm curious, and we want to develop the ideas that would maybe shed the light, maybe improve systems. Maybe it's very hard. The business we're in, or part of what you are doing right now, we're doing podcasts, is getting very crowded. I remember you noticed that you're seeing polarization there, and separate different sides taking over. I told you that I have my fears with things like podcast is that 10 years ago, well, probably now more, about 10, 12 years ago, podcasts were like, you could fit people in one bus that did podcasts. Mm-hmm. Now it's exploded. It's so big. Thousands of podcasts are starting today as we're talking right now. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, and it's wonderful and it's beautiful but the problem that I'm seeing is how corporate podcast production companies are moving into the space and occupying it again. And we're seeing that those barriers that we used to have. 20 years ago, for you, in order to publish your thoughts, you had to go and beg some New York Times or whatever publication that is still going to edit you. They're going to decide whether you're worthy to publish with them. And most likely they will reject you because they have their own slew of writers and it was a little bit of an elite thing to do, right? All of a sudden, those gatekeepers, they're gone. Now I see them rising again through corporations that have bigger voice, that have much larger budgets to come into the space and drag attentions of everybody.
How do you advise your clients to get around that?
Several ways. Unfortunately, one of the things that I'm noticing in our space is that it's difficult to be heard on the level that, let's say, your podcast deserves, because I listen to it. It's a good content. It's difficult to be heard on that level unless you go and pursue partnerships. And that's again about gatekeepers. The place became so crowded that when you really want to be heard by many, many people, you cannot avoid partnerships. I wish I could tell you, just 5 years ago, I would tell you, market it. Yeah. Market it. I'm still going to tell you, market it. Absolutely. Yeah. PR, marketing. It's like you are writing a book. This is your book. This is your product. What are you going to do? You're going to tell the world about it. Keep telling the world about it. But without partnerships with larger organizations, Spotify. One thing is to have your podcast on Spotify. It's very easy. The other thing is to have them as partners, which they will probably ask if they ever decide to go with a specific podcast. And they're pitched all the time. They're pitched these partnerships all the time. They'll probably ask for part of your IPs, intellectual property rights, and it's going to be up to you how much you're willing to give them. So it's getting very Hollywoodized, if you will, right? People are hiring agents to make sure that they're promoting and speaking for you.
You know, it seems like, we've made a decision here that, and by the way, this came a little bit from, I've watched your podcast and you talk about this, but we've decided that it's not just about numbers. I mean, numbers are great, but, the question I was asked by a friend of mine, Joe Polish, he said, well, if you could have 10 people who watched your show that loved it and that paid attention to every detail, or 1 million people who maybe watched 1 in 100 and didn't care, which would you rather have? And I came to the conclusion, I want the 10.
You want a 10.
All right, I want the 10, and which means it's not about money, and it's not about the numbers. It's about trying to make a difference. And in trying to make a difference, I want to try to get to those people who believe that optimism is important. But that says to me, I don't know if there's riches in the niches with podcasts, but I do believe that it's the niches where there are still lots of opportunity. You talked about doctors a moment ago, and doctors very specifically who are dealing with psychological issues. And to me, that would be a very smart podcast. There'd be a lot of doctors
for sure
who would pay attention to that. And it may be a niche play, but it would be the type of niche play that it wouldn't be 1 million people who paid a little bit of attention. It would be thousands of people who paid a lot of attention.
And I like how you think, because that's the way to approach the podcast. It's the best thing to utilize podcasts as a media, because that's exactly what it allows you to do. It allows you to go specifically after your niche audiences. And it's not by geography, it's not by profession, it's by interest.
All right, so if you were giving advice to somebody listening right now that says, I want to start a podcast, start by telling me what's the 3 things that you would tell them to do.
Idea is first. Idea is so vital. And make sure that your idea is not the idea that I have, that
and the idea
Paul
shouldn't
has.
be just start a podcast.
Exactly. What is your idea? What are you going? What kind of change are you making with that idea? If you're going to go and talk to entrepreneurs, there are millions of podcasts that talk about entrepreneurship. What is your angle? Is that maybe about entrepreneurs that bake cakes? Is that entrepreneurs that wear yellow socks? And it's up to you, but I want to hear about your idea. It has to be strong. And you have to present your idea first to a number of people that are willing to listen to you and provide you feedback that you would not like, will be willing to accept that feedback and work on your idea, hone your idea before you proceed with it. And then just try to get the best voices for your idea, the best voices, because I'm sure when you're coming up with idea, you already know what you're going to talk about. Sometimes it's your expertise. Sometimes you want to entertain people. The second thing is think always about a public. Podcast is not a microphone where you're talking to a public, although it might feel this way. Mm-hmm. You're talking with the public. Mm-hmm. It's a community. You're creating community. You're not on the stage. You're with the people. Think about those people. Think who you're trying to reach. What do you want? How do you want them to perceive your, put on their shoes and feel how it goes and do a lot of testing with that. You're talking, it's a both way. It's a conversation that goes both way, and always keep it in mind. The third, you're going to get better. You just do it. No matter what. The first podcast episode, probably first, second, third, maybe first 10 episodes, you'll hate your voice. You will not like how you sound. The music will be off. The production will be off. Produce bad content first. Be okay with terrible content. Mm-hmm. That's the only way to get to the content that is going to sound excellent.
Yeah, you definitely learn by it. I mean, but I love those three things. The first one is make certain that you have an idea, and an idea that matters to you. Not just that matters to other people, but that matters to you. The second one is have a target audience that you care about. And the third thing that you said is practice. And boy, we've learned that here, right? You don't get your sound quality right the first time. You don't get your video quality right the first time. I'm not asking the questions right correctly, right? I've told you in the very beginning, I can talk a lot more than I can listen. It's been a lifetime problem, but nonetheless, learning to listen more as opposed to talking more. All those things you start to improve upon, which is what I like about the podcast. I'm 63, and I feel like I'm learning a whole new thing. For me, it's fun. I'm enjoying it. I have a healthcare business. I have real estate. I have lots of grandkids and family, but this is something that I'm really enjoying learning. Okay, so if somebody wanted to contact you to have you help them with their podcast or their business, how would they get a hold of you and your business?
My website is openconversation.com, so singular, openconversation.com. And there we have a form that you can fill out, or you can just reach out to me at my email, Regina, Regina, at openconversation.com.
So you'll find when you go to that, you'll find a number of other podcasts that you've helped that are really pretty good podcasts. I've really enjoyed listening to them. And then your own. You're pretty exceptional at what you do.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And so are you, Paul. I'm so happy that you're in this space. I'm really happy when people that are not coming from a journalism background or a storytelling background just do this. Because
when's your book come out?
My book.
Yeah. You got to have a book. This has been an amazing story just to listen to. If you don't have a book, you need to go work on one, because that is a fascinating story.
Thank you, Paul. Maybe when I retire, I'll do it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.